terrible, unbearable. Who would ever do this? And in no time, as
it was
with
so
most fashions.
advanced when you think that the bob was, I guess, in the 20s in America, and something like that was going on. In
I'm sure it was not as short as that.
No,
but
still.
They claimed that my favorite account says that they look like they're wearing little heads of cabbage, that the hair is all short and curly, and that they considered absolutely terrible. And then one of the king's mistresses wore it, and everyone thought it was the greatest look possible. So, as usual, things change fast in the world of fashion.
Well, this was also the time of the advent of a culture of shopping, where shopping itself became an entertainment and a spectacle. And that's interesting. I mean, we do tend to take that for granted today. But the idea of going shopping, I guess for women in particular, was launched during this period. Could you talk a little bit about that?
It's the first time that women can go shopping, and it's considered appropriate for a woman, even a woman alone or women with other women. They don't need, this is an activity that women can indulge in. It's the first time that one could go into shops. We have the first image, once again, 1678, and we don't know how many shops there were at that point, but it's the idea of a luxury interior. And visitors from England were constantly shocked by this, that you could go in there, things would be beautifully displayed. People had shopped in the street before. Shops were just, the shop part of it was just a storehouse, and merchants opened for the day by lowering the bottom shutter and to make a table, raising the top half of the shutter to make a protection over the table, and laying out their goods on the table. And at this point, they change completely and make interiors beautiful and have shop girls beautifully dressed, and people could go in and shop inside. It just becomes a great activity.
Well, it's interesting. I guess there's a sense in which it was a liberating activity, in some sense, for women, for all that you don't think of shopping that way, but they could go out alone.
Absolutely. And all kinds of activities like this that allow women to think about going out, for going to cafes, going out at night. People begin shopping and shopping at night. Once the street lighting is another of the great innovations of the reign, and that's something that Louis XIV orders directly put into place, not only to create shopping at night. He's thinking of the safety of the city. Merchants have been complaining because there were so many bands of thieves, and so it was unsafe to go home at the end of the day with your proceeds from the day in your pockets. They didn't want to be robbed. And so France sets the first system of street lighting anywhere in the world, and it changes everything. Then it becomes the sort of romance of doing things in the evening.
Right, and it extends the consumer culture into the evening.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can go out to have a drink at a cafe in the evening. You can go out shopping in the evening. And foreign tourists were clearly so taken with this. One of my favorite lines from a German guidebook advises people to come to Paris and stand at an intersection, they said, of several streets and just look at the lights, which for us it would be sort of pitiful. I mean, there were 3,000 lanterns in Paris in 1667 when it starts, and it became 6,000 at the end of the century, so 2 lanterns per street. We would not perhaps have thought of much, but when you think of a totally black city beforehand and the idea of regular lights at regular intervals, I think it's pretty extraordinary.
Right,
and it was
spectacular.
And it was a huge, huge investment. I think it was something, they burned something like 1,500 pounds of candle per night. It's a lot of candle, which is expensive, and it was millions of dollars per year on this.
Right.
So it's a big change.
You mentioned the cafes, which we do associate with French culture still, and certainly coffee houses had existed before, but not cafe society. That's specific to France, and I guess to Louis XIV. What's the difference?
Well, coffee houses, I mean, coffee didn't catch on in France for a long time. Coffee was drunk much more commonly in England. I think it's 1650, the first coffee house in Europe, in England, then in the Netherlands. So there's a lot of coffee being drunk in other countries. The French were just not interested in this, but the coffee house was simple. Coffee was, and you didn't have much to eat. I think they served beer and sausages. Men went there to smoke, and women didn't go to coffee houses. There are occasional images showing women serving in coffee houses, but it was not a place frequented by women, and that never interested the French. And then I think it's 1665 that someone gets an idea of creating something completely different, and he creates something elegant, and this catches on immediately. So that by the end of the century, there are hundreds of cafes in Paris. Some claim there were more than one on every street. I don't think that could have been true. But clearly it's become part of the culture. And the cafe was from the beginning elegant. It had mirrors or paintings or tapestries on the walls. They had marble tables, chandeliers. The waiters dressed in what they considered, many of the people who founded the first cafes were of Armenian background, so they dressed in what they imagined to be Armenian garments, but gave exotic look to it. They served you coffee in porcelain cups with silver servers, so everything was elegant. It was expensive, and you didn't eat sausage. You ate pastries or something lovely, a nice snack.
And women were encouraged
and women
to go, which is
not only
key.
were encouraged, women went in numbers. Women went, the clergy went, everyone went. The coffee house, the cafe was a totally respectable place, indeed a very fashionable place to be seen.
That's very interesting that in all of these cases, the women were incorporated in this culture of aesthetics.
Absolutely,
which was, I guess, different from what you found throughout the rest of Europe.
Not only incorporated, Paul, often creating it. They were clearly the minds behind it. Much of the fashion industry, we have reports of the young children, like the grandchildren, the wives of grandchildren of Louis XIV, meeting with designers to try to dictate what the season would be, so that women are active in all aspects of this. And writing about it. It's from women's letters and diaries that most of my information came about, because they were attentive to what was new and what they had never seen before and how it was going to change their lives.
Now, what about food and champagne or wine? Again, we do think of France as the place to eat. And it's not just that the food is good, but that food and drink is taken seriously, that food, it's an experience to eat a meal. I still think that we don't have that quite in this country. We haven't got that yet. How did that come about? Is that part of the same trend?
And the great movement, I think, of the 17th century in that part is a movement around cookbooks. The great cookbooks. And the first is called The French Chef, Le Cuisinier Français. And after that, there's the French Pastry Chef, just a whole slew of wonderful cookbooks. And what they do is to codify something. And you have to have a cuisine, it has to be codified, you have to have rules. And the French chef starts doing it immediately, explaining so many of the basics that are still the basics of French cooking. And you have how to make, how to deal with your herbs, how to do stock. All those things are explained. The French pastry chef gives the basic rules for doing puff pastry, all kinds of things that are just essential.
It's spelled out.
Absolutely, you
sort
know
of like
exactly.
the dress, the way the outfits are spelled
exactly,
out.
And that's what's key. Telling people so that it can be copied, and that means that something can be made in other places, but it will be known as French. And so it's that idea of having a spread like that I think is so important.
It amazes me how this has persisted from that time until the present, although I wanted to ask you whether you feel that in recent years, perhaps the past decade, some of the association of these things with France has eroded a bit because of the global economy, because of perhaps changes in taste, because of shifts in trends. Do you think that France is still at the vanguard in these areas that you just discuss in the
Well, there's much discussion, right? Food, for example. Barcelona was being touted as the new place to be. And then recently that's not continuing, so there'll be someplace else. And so there are many other capitals advanced and many other styles of cuisine and of food preparation, but France still stays in there and so has never lost. And as long as others come and go, I mean, the French often worry about this, as you can imagine, but as long as others come and go, I think there's no problem. Italy, for quite a while, was seen as the place that Milan might take over from Paris in the fashion industry, and recent years that all the newspapers seem to proclaim year after year, Paris is back. You know, Paris has taken over again and has no rival.
Right.
So I think that, you know, that remains a sort of persistence. It's that sort of the unity of everything, having one beautiful city that is known for so many things and having them all in the same areas. That history of it, I think, is also important. The fact that you have many companies founded so long ago, still in operation, so many of the names still there, and so many of the places. The Place Vendôme is the luxury jewelry center of France now. That was already starting in the late 17th century.
And those places persist because there is a sense, I guess, that some of these places are going out of business, are being bought by multinational companies, that some of the restaurants are perhaps not as good as they once were. Do you feel that's true? I mean, you know France well. What do you
In some
feel?
areas, sometimes there will be a loss of quality, and then in others there will be these remarkable returns. You know, the places that are then acquired are famous jewelers, etc. I'm not going to give any names that are acquired. But then what's remarkable is that the people who acquire them will then want, because the history sells too, so they'll want to develop it. So I've met almost every firm now has a historian, you know, researching the past, bringing things back, following, returning to classic designs, so that in some ways I think that there is not a loss of quality. Indeed, and then many, I think with Louis Vuitton and things like that, the whole marketing of all the, you know, the LVMH brand is really keeping things at a high level of quality and French made.
Right.
And which is seen as key. I think they're worried more about the effects of globalization. What will it do with such far-flung consumers? How do you manage when it's just in Europe is one thing? How do you manage to control the product when you'll be making it at such a much larger scale and for people so far away?
Oh, okay, that it may be degraded in that sense.
And the possibilities. Do you change things for different
to suit
markets?
A different audience.
Exactly. Those are the kind of questions
do
I think people are asking.
Do you think there is still the distinctively French look? And now I guess I'm talking about fashion or style, or the way particularly a woman looks when she walks down the street. I remember when I first visited France 30 years ago, it was so striking to me to see the way women looked on the street. They were so distinctively chic. But when I've gone back, it hasn't been as remarkable.
No, I think the shock is much less great than it used to be, and in part because different kinds of looks, an American look that young people wear, have invaded, so that you have, also there are many more foreigners on the streets of Paris, so that one is not seeing as exclusively a French audience as one did. So I think that's certainly true, but there are certainly ways there are things that are made in France, different styles that are French styles that you wouldn't find anyplace else.
Yeah. Well, you do have an apartment in Paris. Oh, I'm so envious of you. So you live part of the time here and part of the time there. Do you feel there's a difference in the quality or the rhythm of your life there? Perhaps you're doing different things when you're there versus when you're here.
When I'm there for long periods, it's essentially the same life, and it definitely is different.
And what is the difference? Could you just in a nutshell?
Many things. People complain all the time that we have no sense of vacation. Yeah. How is it that I'm not able to take weeks and weeks, or willing, or imagining that my life should consist of weeks and weeks of vacation? What is this, a Sunday, and you're working? There are many things. And then much longer hours. I actually don't know how people can manage. They seem not to sleep because you're out. When I'm there, I'm doing research and writing, so I don't have to be up and at the office at 9. I don't know how people do it with the way the hours at which dinner parties finish.
They stay up late and then they have to get up
very late. Very late.
Do they spend a lot of money on clothes and food?
I think much more on food than we do, much more. People still have, when they entertain, really proper meals. Not everyone anymore. When you have good friends, you can cut corners, but with real courses. All first course, main course, cheese, salad, dessert, and things are very expensive there. You're paying for a quality of produce and everything.
Now, who's cooking those meals?
I don't know how some of my friends do it. They're still cooking them.
They're
still cooking them, and very little is purchased out. It drives me crazy because I can't cut corners either.
Yeah.
So women are still doing it. And sometimes very complicated things.
Yeah, that's the thing I could never quite understand, but I certainly enjoy.
I do too. I think it's wonderful, and they're keeping up. And people also still have the sense that you should have a country place, a city place, and maybe more than one. The families never sell real estate, so it stays in the family.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Joan DeJean, for talking to us today. I wish we could talk longer.
Thank you so much. It was fun.
It was fun. And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel interview.